So, what I'd like to talk about today is a little bit of an expansion of what I talked about Wednesday morning here, the half-day sitting we have. And the simple way is that, the simplest kind of introduction is that it has to do with as we practice, we develop a growing set of reference points that guide us in our practice. And so we no longer guided by instructions from other people, from the texts, but rather from ourselves, because we have developed these reference points of something really good, really healthy and wholesome that is available to us, we know for ourselves. And so we know how to go forward. We know how to find our way and what is useful and healthy to do. And it's phenomenal to have that shift from taking Buddhism as an external reference point for your life versus having internalized something that you know for yourself as a reference. So that is the basic kind of premise for today's talk. And in the course of it, maybe also it'll give you a sense of why in mindfulness meditation we put tremendous importance on mindfulness of the present moment. Sometimes the present moment I feel, gets over idealized in our scene, and like it's all good just to be in the present moment. But it's the purpose of being in the present moment has a particular purpose, particular reason. If you understand that, it's a lot easier to do this practice. I remember many years ago there was a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon that had something like Calvin and Hobbes were climbing a tree. It looked like a glorious day like today, and they were climbing a tree, and Calvin says, I paraphrase it, something like, "Oh, it's so great just to be in the present moment, enjoying life this way." Sounds like perfect, mindfulness. And Hobbes says to Calvin, "Yes, but you're supposed to be at school right now." And that was kind of a little bit my problem taking my kids to school when they were in preschool and kindergarten, is I was in the present moment taking them to school, but as we walked out of our front door to get to the car, they were really in the present moment with the flowers outside our house, the little sticks that were there, and they were really present. And there was a conflict between two present moments. So the present moment. So somehow I want to also do as an introduction to this idea of the references for practice. That a really big turning point for me in my involvement with Buddhism was the day I decided to devote my life to Buddhist practice in the form, and that took the form back then, being a Zen student, to deciding I wanted to be ordained as a Zen monastic. And being a monastic, for me, was not becoming a teacher, but rather dedicating my whole life to Buddhist practice. But the reason that I had for it was that I wanted to be able to address the suffering of this world. And I wanted to be able to address it at its root. And back then, when I was younger, the root I felt was the attachment we have to self. And I knew, in my limited experience of life, I knew of nothing else that touched that root than Buddhist practice. And I had already been wanting to address some of the suffering of the world. I went to, very different than what I'm doing now. My undergraduate degree is in agronomy, so agriculture. I was going to be a farmer. But in the course of that education, I became familiar with the growing potential catastrophe around the world of soil erosion. And it seemed like very few people knew about it. Back then, it was nuclear proliferation was the big thing that people were focusing on, trying to stop. But my thing was I was so aware of soil erosion was a huge issue, and so at some point I decided I actually applied to go to graduate school to study soil science, so that I could go around the world and address the issues of soil erosion. And so that was kind of the contrast, between deciding to become Buddhist and then deciding not to be a soil scientist and soil conservationist. And the rationale that I gave myself for that was that no matter how successful I was at conserving soil, protecting the world from soil erosion, which is a necessary thing to do, I don't want to diminish the importance of it, it would never really touch the heart, the depth of people's suffering, the existential suffering of people. And I would feel like I would always have a dissatisfaction. I always feel like it's not quite enough. And I didn't know if I'd be effective in being a Buddhist monastic and helping the suffering of the world. But at least I felt like I'd had the satisfaction that I was trying to address it at its roots. And that seemed like a big task. And I didn't quite know what the roots were. I had an intuition. This was more like an intuition that was operating based on a number of years of having practiced. And I had some sense it had to do with attachment, and as I said, attachment to self. And those kind of, to say that, maybe it's kind of idealistic, it's kind of like maybe recognized as being some of the grand ideas of what Buddhism is about. And maybe that's good, or maybe not. But now we get to this topic of the reference. And the references for practice maybe aren't so grand. Maybe are not so amazingly idealistic. Maybe they're very ordinary in some ways. And so they're not idealistic. It doesn't look like, wow, this is the end of suffering once and for all, and end of attachment to self. Wow, that would be fantastic. Enlightenment. Thank you. And so, maybe I'll get criticized either way. If I do the idealistic thing, then the people who want to be practical say, well, that's, that has nothing to do with my life. But the people who, if I'm really ordinary with it and simple, then the people who say, well, that Buddhism is much more than that. So it's hard to be a Buddhist teacher. So, but the reference points. So this has been on my mind a little bit because in the last few weeks I had an occasion where I think on the same day I had a desire for a particular Buddha statue that I had seen a number of them about, and I kind of wanted to have one, and not for myself, but I wanted to have one, to get one, and maybe give it to someplace. When I came back to the United States, I was in Japan, and oddly enough, in the small little towns I was in, the only place it was liable to find this particular statue was at a I think they were called boseki in Japanese, a gravestone store. So I had to try to go to the various people and try to explain to them grave stores. So why would a Westerner in Japan want to go to grave stores? And I had a hard time getting them to understand, and because my Japanese was pretty poor. But I finally found one and went there, and so it was a bit of a project, right? to look for where I can buy this kind of thing. And then later in the day, there was an occasion to consider. It was evoked in me a feeling of generosity, of giving something to someone. And then those two states of mind contrasted each other. And I saw that in some ways, when my mind had the desire for this Buddha statue, my mind got narrower, got smaller, got a little bit more contracted, focusing on getting this thing. But when the generosity was there, my mind became more open, more relaxed, more at ease. And that difference is a reference point. Which of those mind states is more useful? which of the mind states would I like to live in? Which of the mind states do I want to allow for? What I do with my mind is a really important thing. What I do with my heart is a really important thing. And which of those do I want to predominate and become the predominant characteristic of my mind? And I know there are times in my life where the predominant characteristic of my mind has been attachment, clinging, caught up in greed or desires for something. There are times the predominant characteristic has been resentment or anger or hostility, and that's what's caught up. Sometimes it's been fear or anxiety for things that probably I didn't need to be afraid of, but I was still kind of, the contraction of the mind, the narrowing of the mind, the tightening of the mind, the stress on the mind that certain states have. And there was a time in my life where I didn't know I was having this. I didn't know there was any, it was just so ordinary to have a stressful mind, a contracted mind, a caught up mind, churning away with its concerns. I just thought, well, I didn't even think about it. This was human life. As I started to practice more and more, an alternative became clearer and clearer. And the alternative was a mind which had no contraction, a heart that was not caught up in something, and had a level of peace in it, or calm, or openness, or joy, or delight. All these things are kind of characteristics of an alternative kind of mind. And they don't all happen at once, but at different times you feel different ones. And they set up a contrast between something that in Buddhism is considered unhelpful to have and something which is helpful, something which is wholesome and versus something that's unwholesome. And that becomes a personal reference point. That becomes sometimes it feels somatic, so it's really personal and direct and immediate. Sometimes it feels more mental. Sometimes it feels more something of a part of our emotional life. We really feel there's an alternative. And so even coming down here today, I walked down here and I was going to think about this talk a little bit and walk down. And as I started thinking about it, I could see that my mind was doing that stressful thing. It was starting to get narrow and focused on it and concerned about it. And maybe even like, what are people going to think? And how am I going to say it right so that no one attacks me? Something like that. It was just a little bit like it was happening. And I knew better. I know an alternative. The alternative is close at hand. So for me, there's a reference point that is kind of ever present, that is guiding me. And so as I was, my thinking mind was going down that track, I knew immediately, this is not interesting. I don't want to live my life that way. This is not the world I want to live in, that is caught up in thoughts and concerns this way, and fears or preoccupations. And so in this context, it was relatively easy just to let it go. And so it wasn't that I had stopped thinking about the talk, or what to talk about here, but rather now my thinking, the quality of my thinking had changed, and now it was like having a friend in my mind. That was it was a friendly mind. There was this friendly, light, kind of nice way of thinking about what was going on. Was just nice to have that friend there. Whereas before, that mind was me, I guess. Both are me, but I wouldn't have characterized it as my friend. Sometimes, it's the taskmaster. Sometimes, all kinds of, the other characteristics. So we have these reference points, and in these that I've described today for myself, I think they were more mental. Though in mental, they were also somatic, because the ways in which the mind contracts and gets tight and caught up, I feel a little bit as tension around my forehead, around my eyes, kind of behind my forehead in the area of the front of the brain. I don't know exactly what's going on there, but that's what it feels like. And I think of it as a thinking muscle that I can relax. Other times it's clearly embodied. Sometimes the reference point has been my belly. And sometimes I have a soft belly, and then, it's all tight in a knot. It used to be before I started practicing, it was always tight in a knot. And then it took years for that knotted stomach to relax and relax and relax. And luckily I was not in a hurry, because if I had been and thought I was the terrible person for having a tense stomach, I would have made more tense. And but it took years of my practice to slowly relax that belly. And that made a world of difference. And now I have this reference point that's kind of there. Oh, there it is. Maybe I should take a look. My belly tensed up. What just happened? As opposed to the belly tensed up, and this means there's something dangerous and I need to fight or flight. I've learned not to kind of let these changes in the body and mind and heart drive the ship. I've learned to recognize them and say, is this what I want to do? What's really going on here? Let's take a deeper look. What's happening here? And usually, the tense stomach is not useful. There are sometimes I have what could be considered a tense stomach when I'm having fun and playing. And that seems okay. Then I'll put up with it. Then it's a fine thing to have. But there are times when it's really an indication that something is off. And so I have that reference point. I have had that reference point with my hands. My hands will tighten up in certain circumstances, or I start kind of playing too much with my fingers, because I'm afraid or something. And that's a reference point. The shoulders are a reference point. I've had a reference point in my chest where I feel like my heart is closed. And there was a time in my life, I think I was about 15, where someone teased me about something or belittled me about something I just said, and I immediately there was a decision. Like, it wasn't even me. It was like something deeper, somatic. Something I could feel something close in my heart, and I said I'm never going to show that to anyone again. And it took years for that to open up and relax and be willing to share a more vulnerable place of who I was. And so we have these things that we do that don't serve us very well. And as we practice, they begin to relax, begin to open, begin to soften, and things quiet down. And the important thing that as this happens is to take that seriously, not as something to get attached to, but rather something that can help you read yourself, become a self-whisperer. I love this phrase, they just used to be first it started by horse whisperers, but now it's everything. And this is the first time I've ever heard someone say self-whisperer. But I think it's something profound, this idea of, to have that kind of sensitivity to yourself, that you really know yourself deeply and well, that a lot of people don't actually know themselves. They might know very well what they're thinking about, what they believe and what they will fight for, but they haven't really tuned into the deeper operating systems, the deeper movements that's going on. And often people are living one-dimensional life in a sense. And as we practice, there's more dimensions of who we are reveal itself. And what I'm pointing to today is that what reveals itself is that we have this place where the mind can be relaxed and at ease, the heart can be at ease, the body can be at ease in some way or other. Versus it can get stressed. The body feels stressed, and sometimes the stress is kind of comes from outside, but sometimes it's clearly we're contributing to it. And so we're kind of working with this, what's stressful and not stressful. In fact, there's one of the main translators of the Buddha's teachings to English is a monk in San Diego named Thanissaro Bhikkhu, who comes here sometimes and teaches. And the common English translation of the Buddhist word dukkha is suffering. And suffering is such a big thing. It's like, what do we mean even? But this monk, Thanissaro Bhikkhu, he translates dukkha as stress. And immediately, I think it gives a kind of almost somatic reference point, a clear reference point. And he's actually said that, I think he's the one who said it, that getting married is one of the most stressful things people do. Now, you wouldn't say, getting married is the biggest suffering people have. I mean, especially at the wedding. That's not quite right. But to appreciate that it's stressful, that's understandable. And so that word stress really makes it much more applicable, this teachings and this practice, that if we always, like I do, maybe too much, emphasize suffering, 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 and the end of it. Stress in the end of it. And maybe so this idea of stress and the absence of it becomes a powerful reference point. And so this is not idealistic ideology. It's not necessarily Buddhist, you have to believe Buddhist teachings. This becomes a time when we learn to believe ourselves. We believe and see for ourselves what works and doesn't work. And even if the Buddha came here today and he walked in and he said, hey, you should stop listening to this guy. Everything I said was wrong. You go find something else to do because I completely had it wrong, and you just forget all this Buddhist stuff. And you would say, well, that's maybe nice for you, but I know for myself. I've discovered I have this personal reference point. I know the difference between getting stressed and not stressed. If you want to use the big word, getting involved in suffering and not getting entangled with it. Getting attached and not being attached. That is so clear and so obvious that that's going to guide my life, because I know one is better than the other. One is healthier than the other. One provides much more wisdom. One provides much more kindness and support. One represents the world I want to live in. The other represents a world I don't want to live in. And just imagine, at least some of you who are not saints, and just imagine that at that situation, a time when you were at your worst, caught up in anger and resentments and attachments and greed, or whatever it might have been, your thing. Just imagine multiplying that by the billions of people we have on this planet. That's the illness that's spread across the land, and everyone has it. That's not the world we want to live in. Is there an alternative? Can we live in a world of peace? Can we live in a world where everyone comes from that possibility in the mind, where the mind is free, where the mind is free of its clinging, attachment, hates, resentments? And I think that as we live our social life, having these two references are invaluable. Because as we get more and more sensitive, and that's part of the purpose of mindfulness, is to be in the present moment, and then be sensitive to the distinction between that stress and not stress, being open or closed in unhealthy ways. And at some point we can feel that towards people, some people for whatever reason, we feel some fear or some judgments or some little bit hostility or some negative orientation. But as we see the mind go that way, we feel the impact it has on us. And we see, this is not good for me. I'm diminishing myself to get involved in that kind of ideation and thoughts and judgments and ideas. And because we have this reference point and alternative, then we're much less likely to get caught in our bias and our prejudice and our judgments and hostilities of people. And I've had an occasion recently where someone said something critical of me, and I could feel kind of the mind begin to go in the direction of being defensive or critical back, or how could you say that? I could but it was so brief because of this reference point that I live with all the time. And in these circumstances, immediately I just dropped it and turned to the person and said, can you tell me more? What do you mean? And then I just said, okay. And that was enough, in that circumstance. And how different would it have been if I responded to the old way of, defensive and criticalness, and how could you, and let me tell you, and, and when you did it. And it wasn't a moralistic thing. It wasn't like the ethical thing is to be kind. The ethical thing is to avoid being judgmental. It is deeper. It goes down to the roots. It was, is it stressful for me or not stressful? Is there a better way to engage the world and people? And this is what I kind of mean by the roots. Really get down to the roots of where things are, where we can feel and sense and know for ourselves. And so it can be very ordinary in ordinary circumstances, this reference point. It doesn't seem grand and religious and, ultimately spiritual. But to live this way and fill your life with this way is, from a Buddhist point of view, a spiritual life. And it changes the world we live in, changes ourselves. And it has a huge impact on ourselves over time. And eventually maybe does lead to enlightenment. Wouldn't that be nice? The small little steps that lead all the way. So those are my thoughts today. And we have 15 minutes before the potluck. What I'd like to suggest is that is partly so that those of you who want to stay or not stay, you can just kind of be friendly with each other a little bit, and so to go into groups of 3 or so or 4, and have a little conversation about what was useful about my talk, what touched you in some way. So, that was wonderful to sit here and listen to you talk. I both feel delightful to hear your seeming enjoyment in talking about this, whatever you were talking about. And it also stood out to me that was a lot of energy after sitting and meditating before, and so maybe it's good to come back and be a little bit quiet for a few minutes as we kind of settle things a little bit. And but as I said, I offer to, if anyone has any questions, it doesn't have to be a question, it could be a testimonial or something that's important for you to say at this point. But if any questions about the talk or clarification or anything anybody like to say.
So I have a question because you were talking about mind. You said that I have 2 voices in my mind. One of them is got so caught up with these thoughts that's bringing a lot of pain and suffering. Yeah. The other mind is telling me peace and joy and then a lot of good things. And you said they both are me, but I prefer the other one. When you said that, it kind of hit me because I read a lot of books. I know a lot of teachings. They are trying to teach us, I am not my body. I am not my mind. And then when you said that, I'm like, oh no. So they both are me. So the both voices are actually me. So I am actually my mind. So I find that's kind of, there's a conflict there. So can you please explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is not directly to your question. So it isn't so much the way I didn't say this, but it's not so much that there's 2 sides of my mind, but rather there's a surface mind and a deeper mind. That's more how I feel it. And the surface mind is very much fueled by attachment to self, attachment to outcomes, all kinds of things that we have. And for better or for worse, the analogy I have for this kind of mind is squeezing a toothpaste tube. If you take the lid off the the tube and then squeeze it, it'll just keep coming out and out and out for a long time. You can brush it away as much as you want, but it'll keep coming out. And so the surface mind is a little bit like that. If we're always tense and squeezing it with our whatever attachments, stress we have, that surface mind is going to keep doing all kinds of nonsense. Just doesn't want to stop. But if we stop squeezing it, then it allows the deeper mind to show itself. And that's the one that tends to be wiser or friendlier or more peaceful. And I think of it as being much more holistic. As long as the surface mind is being squeezed by attachments, by clinging, by resistance and all of my me, it doesn't have access to the full wholeness of who we are. And this deeper mind is more full. So that's the way of not answering your question directly. Now I'll try to do it more directly. Yes, there's a very strong teaching in Buddhism about, the body is not self, the mind is not self, all things is not self. And but it's best to take those teachings in context, as opposed to take them as being, this is like, you can never say anything about, this is not me. In ordinary language, it's fine to say, these are my shoes, and it's okay. You don't have to be attached to your shoes. And if someone has taken your shoes, you say, well, those are my shoes, and they say, well, I prefer them to mine. And then you might say, okay, please take them. There's a story with many years ago, 20 years ago, I don't know when it was. I have a friend who's a Buddhist monk, and he had one of the first, what looked like the smartphones. It was like a really intelligent phone. Maybe it wasn't a smartphone yet, but it was like the next best thing to it. And before they came out, and I looked at him and I said, "What do you have vows of poverty? You're a renunciant. Why do you have this?" And he said, well, it was a gift. And I felt it was okay to receive the gift. If someone ever asked me for it, I would give it to them. And so I was tempted. So to say these are my shoes, or this is my hair. You go to someone's going to cut your hair. I'm like, my wife cuts my hair, and I say, will you cut my hair today? It's my hair. I'm not saying like cut someone's hair. Then it should be, well, you cut someone's hair today, or will you cut this hair here? And it's not me, but it's the hair's growing here. And life gets so complicated if you try to avoid the word my. It can be done innocently, and it actually points to something essential, something important. And what Buddhism is about is not having any fixed idea of self. There's no fixed self, no fixed identity. That's where the problem is, the fixed idea. So, but it's actually healthier to kind of have an ordinary, simple idea. So when I said there's two sides of me, these two ways of thinking, I wasn't essentializing them. I wasn't making the fixed idea, this is who I am. There's probably other sources of thinking in me as well. And I'm not assuming that it's, and because it's in my own mind, or in the mind that's in this body and mind, then this body and mind is the place for taking responsibility for it, especially when it's causing harm. And sometimes it's really helpful to avoid these pronouns mine, me, I. It's really helpful. It frees something up. And sometimes it's actually more responsible to say it. It's like if you're going to apologize to someone, you don't say, well, sorry, or something, or that there is apology here. They would like to hear you say, I'm sorry. Then it carries more weight. So we have to be fluid in how we use this. So that was a long answer. Did I address it well enough?
Yeah, I think so. So what I'm understanding is it's kind of like saying, okay, these two thoughts, they are both in me.
Yeah.
They kind of in my mind,
Right.
but they are not like my mind
Right.
or me,
Yeah, yeah.
but they are existing there in me. That's what I'm understanding
Yeah, yeah.
from what you just
Yeah,
explained.
these exist, and something else that exists in here is now going to use it as a reference. And as the practice goes deeper, there are times when that there's no feeling even that there is a self, a central locus of self that's part of it. It feels much more intuitive or relaxed, and it's a whole different way of operating in the world that's radically different than how most people operate when they have coagulated around some notion of self. There's a locus that our attachments, a sum total of our attachments and clinging, can give us a very, sometimes very powerful, sometimes very meaningful sense of some kind of center that, oh, this is who I am. But if we bring our attention to that center, we feel it's a little bit of tension, a little bit of pressure. And what's fascinating to do when you're quiet and still enough in the mind, to bring the mindfulness to that locus of tension that we associate with this is who I am, and see it dissolve like the dew on a hot day. What then? So we do one more, and then it's time for the potluck. And I'll stay here if you want to ask questions afterwards as we go. But
Hello. This is only my second time here, so hi.
welcome.
I have an array of questions, but I don't know the specific thing I'm trying to ask, but hopefully your way of answering will also coincide. But something I've been struggling with is I feel like I've been having an existential crisis for a really, really long time. And now I think something that you said today really resonated with me, that was when you said, it's really hard to be a Buddhist teacher. And when you were saying should I be a soil scientist or dedicate my life to this? And that you were saying that the world, billions of us, there's suffering everywhere. And I think now that I'm older, in my 30s, I finally realized that I want to heal the suffering somehow, but I don't know how exactly. And it feels like I'm alone in that, everyone around me doesn't care the way that I care. Yes. So long story short is I'm wondering, how did you decide to do something the road less paved, I guess? And also, how did you maintain your cool and be tell me more? Okay. When I feel within me, it's just so much fire at sometimes, and then sometimes there's water. It's just so hard to maintain my cool.
Yeah. Yes.
And when I just want to, I just want to make a difference,
Right.
but it feels like it's impossible in this society right now.
Thank you for your question. I love.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
I love your question, your concern, and I take it I'm delighted that you're struggling with this. This is a really good thing to struggle with, what you're doing. I wish more people struggled this way. So I know it's hard for you, but this is, in my heart, this is really good that you're questioning, looking at this, and so thank you for that. So that's my, affirmation of you and what you're up against. Please find your way with it. So that's my heartfelt response. And now maybe a little bit more direct to your question. When I said, it's hard to be a Buddhist teacher, it's hard to be a human being. So it is hard in finding our way. That you care enough for the suffering of the world to want to find some way to respond is fantastic. And the response has to be right for who you are. And, and so different people respond different ways. And some people have certain gifts that they have. That's really the way they do it. Someone who plays music might find it's through music that I do this. And I know someone who was a hospital chaplain who went to visit people who are suffering in the hospital, actually visit children. And he was a musician. And he'd go along with his guitar and would sing to the kids. And so he was using his music to really help kids who were in terrible states of distress. So everyone has to find their own way. And so you have to know yourself well enough to know what your way is. Or you have to experiment, go around and look at different options. And maybe try to find some people who share your orientation. So you said you don't have anybody around you who share what you're about. So I would encourage you to try to find someone, and then if you would like to talk to me at some point about, exploring this territory more personally, I can be available for that.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you all for being here. And so I guess now the potluck is probably ready, and I don't know how it works out there, but it'll be there. And it's a wonderful chance to continue your conversations, get to know each other, and thank you all for being here.